90% of our lives inside of buildings. We're working in them. We are going to school in them. We are living in these buildings. And so when you make a better building, you're positively impacting millions of people's lives around the world.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to start with a really, I think, simple but essential question. What do buildings have to do with climate change?
It's a great question. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's really awesome to be here. So buildings actually contribute 40% to our global greenhouse gas emissions. And
How?
Yes.
I'm sorry. This is... Everything is 40%.
No, you just think everything's 40%.
How many 40% are... So,
Well, at least two.
What is aviation?
2%.
2%. Oh, yeah, that does make sense. The numbers do add up. You're correct. Sorry, continue.
No, but you're right. So I'm stealing emissions from electricity there, right? So 10%. So let's divide the 40% into four parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Three parts, actually. Okay.
Yeah.
So one part, 10% of the slice is direct on-site emissions. And by that, I mean oil, propane, and mostly gas used to heat our spaces and to cook with and heat our water. And then the other chunk that I am double counting, 20%, is from electricity usage on buildings.
Right.
But I think that's really important to note because there's all these solutions we're going to talk about hopefully soon about like how can buildings reduce electricity usage and be more efficient. And that can save emissions at the same time that we're greening the electricity sector. And then the final 10% is from the materials that go into buildings like concrete and steel.
Right.
And again, it's important in my view to attribute that to buildings because they're the demand side of that equation. It's like they're the ones that are deciding to use steel instead of cross-laminated timber or instead of bamboo, right? So there's actually different material selection you can do or different things you can do to actually directly impact those materials.
Right, because construction companies aren't just building for fun, right? It's Lego. Yeah, people, it's obviously to make buildings, which, yeah, that
I think
makes
Ben
sense.
is feeling better about these numbers
Okay,
now.
sorry. I've heard 40% a lot of times and it's so confusing, but that makes so much more sense.
And so we've talked about how they're 40% of emissions, right? When you mean buildings, you mean all kinds of buildings, right?
I mean, it's a great clarifying question. So I basically mean residential and commercial buildings. Industrial facilities, I am excluding from that number. But the reason I love working on buildings is because we spend so much time inside of them, right? So we spend 90% of our lives inside of buildings and we're working in them. We are going to school in them.
Yeah.
We are living in these buildings. And so when you make a better building, you're positively impacting millions of people's lives around the world.
Because it's like literally where you spend almost all of your time, which is quite sad, actually. Maybe we should all go outside some more, but it's a really good point.
Buildings are something that some of us have the privilege not to think about, right? Because if we've always had homes, we've always had places to go that have been relatively comfortable. They just exist. They're just part of the landscape in a way. But can we talk a little bit about how buildings have evolved over time?
I totally agree. Buildings, we sometimes say they're like a giant climate and health and affordability problem that's like hiding in plain sight. And it's almost because we're spending all this time in them, we don't necessarily appreciate that we have to address the emissions and the challenges in buildings. So in the US, electricity emissions have declined nearly 30% over the past 15 years. And we are making a large dent in transportation emissions thanks to the advent of electrification, other technology. But our building emissions have remained stubbornly flat. Wow. We basically haven't made improvements. And that's the challenge that I'm hoping we can address.
Why are we not, or why has that not happened? What's been the thing that's the stumbling block? Is it just because in my mind, I don't see buildings as climate, like I don't see buildings ever. Like I feel like I don't even notice them. Do you know what I mean? Like when I think of climate, I think of like mountains and sea and like environment, and maybe that's like a problem in the way that I'm viewing the issue. But what is it that has stopped that change from being able to happen when everywhere else is making some kind of progress?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons. The first I'd say is just awareness. Awareness from contractors, awareness from homeowners and portfolio owners, so people that own large commercial buildings. And if policymakers don't know that it's not just building efficiency that needs to be part of a climate action plan, it's also getting rid of those on-site emissions, that 10% chunk. So most studies suggest that needs to be done economically with electrification. So we need to electrify buildings. We need to make them highly energy efficient. That piece has been addressed before. And then we also need to eliminate the emissions from the materials that go into new construction. And I think it's those two pieces. They haven't been acknowledged recently by
right.
Yeah, they haven't been on the map in terms of climate policy as much as transportation and electricity have been. And then the second challenge is it is actually, so I think we can build new construction really well. We actually have the technology today to build zero carbon buildings. And in many cases, they are lower cost to build than carbon intensive buildings. But retrofitting buildings, so these old buildings we're sitting in New York, right? This building's probably been sitting here for 150 years.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the second challenge is there's inertia in the system. We have buildings and they sit around for a really long time.
Right.
And then the cost to retrofit a bad building can at times be high.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out the right incentive structures to make that happen.
Because I was going to ask, is the solution here that we knock down all the old buildings and rebuild carbon neutral ones, or you were talking about electrification? What percentage of buildings are we talking nationally, globally? What percentage of buildings roughly are not electrified already? Because in my mind, I'm obviously everywhere's using electricity, or are we talking about clean electricity, which is maybe a different conversation?
Yeah. So in the US, we have 110 million buildings. And 70 million of those are burning fossil fuels on site for gas, oil, and propane. So a very significant percentage of buildings in the US are not electrified.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's a really actually good clarifying point, because we're but we have electricity, right?
Yeah.
The point is where is it coming from? Is it what is fueling it? The point is, what is fueling the electricity, right? Is that part of the problem here? Well,
actually, so RMI has done research to show that basically if you have a gas furnace or a gas heated water heating system or a gas stove, it makes sense. If it's at end of life, it makes sense to swap it out for an electric appliance today, because over the lifetime of that appliance, the electricity mix, due to our wonderful renewable energy targets and goals, is going to get clean enough to make the greenhouse gas emissions from that switch worth it. So in 98% of the U.S. population in locations where they live, that's going to be the case. So, and in those 2% of cases, you might need on-site solar or something to basically fuel that replacement. But basically, and that has not always been the case, right? So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, our electricity mix was not that clean. And so this has been a change, and it means that the economics and the greenhouse gas benefits from electrification have gotten way, way better.
So let's unpack that just a little bit, because I think that's a really interesting thing we don't think about. So when electricity comes into your home, right, from the power grid, it's coming from different sources. It's not always just coming from gas or coal. It could also be coming from renewables, and it's mixed in the grid. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
And so the more renewables come on stream, and the less gas and coal used, then the greener it becomes.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And many utility jurisdictions, as well as across the country, have targets to make the mix of that electricity more and more renewable or zero carbon over time. So California is a great example where they have been ratcheting up their targets for years, and they basically have a plan to have a zero carbon electricity system. And so if you can electrify in states that have targets, it makes a lot of sense.
So if I'm looking around a house, right, where are the places that my emissions exist? So you said gas
stove,
boiler.
gas
boiler. What else are we looking at?
The number one best possible thing you can do is in your home. And if you're a renter, you have other power. We could talk about that. But if you're a homeowner, you can immediately, your gas furnace, your gas water heater, and your gas stove. If you can electrify those appliances and potentially electrify your transportation at the same time, that is the number one biggest impact you can have on your home. I would also just say you should pair that with energy efficiency. So I just got a really awesome insulation upgrade to my house in Colorado. And so now I'm using way less energy. So now when I go to switch out my gas furnace, I can right size that heat pump. I'm not going to overpay for a heat pump.
Right.
Like I can make sure it's highly efficient and I'm not paying more for my energy bills when I electrify.
And this is like a huge problem in the UK.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, very, very.
Anyone from the UK knows their house is not efficient because we're freezing all the time in the winter and we're boiling all the time in the summer.
Yeah. And so I would actually say, as Amory Levins, our founder, likes to say, you got to do the right things in the right order. And I would say you have to start with efficiency to make sure you're not leaking air out of you're infiltrating air into your house that's actually just making your house the wrong temperature in the first place. Fix that, and then you can electrify everything and you will make a significant dent on carbon emissions.
So is that things like replacing windows and stuff? Because I always thought this was just that the conversation about like electricity in houses was just about switching off the light. Do you know what I mean? Like, maybe that's just the way that I was raised. that was the core issue in our household, that we left the lights on. But I always thought that was like the most serious thing and like the biggest waste of electricity in inverted commas. But it sounds like it's not even so much about wasting electricity in so much as it's about where the electricity is being sourced.
It's about both.
Okay,
but
right.
I do think that, I mean, you don't want to use more electricity than you have to, because then your bills are higher, and you're requiring more build out of renewables than we need. And, customers of utilities are the ones that pay for these large build outs. And so you as a utility customer would see that in your bill. So at the end of the day, it's important to conserve. It's important to have really good insulation. And that's like wall insulation, and just make sure your home is tight. And then the best part is when you electrify, you're actually making your home healthier because you're not having, gas stoves release nitrogen dioxide. And that's a really harmful pollutant. And so you are creating healthier indoor air quality. You are, in many cases, creating lower energy bills for your house, and you're doing something good for the climate.
Okay. So I mean, like, I love this conversation. You mentioned something earlier, Stephanie, that I wanted to pick up on, which was about renters, and linking that to the idea of how does this apply to people who are in like low income communities? Yeah,
it's a really great question. So just to give you some numbers in the U.S., those 70 million homes or buildings I mentioned that use fossil fuels on site, 26 million of them are occupied by low and moderate income households. And many of those households suffer from high energy burden, which means that they might have to actually sacrifice basic needs like groceries or other really critical needs for their household in order just to keep their lights on. And that's a terrible situation, right? So we need to make sure basically that portfolio owners, multifamily owners, or landlords in general have the right incentives to electrify and make energy efficient all of their buildings. And some of those incentives did come into place with the Inflation Reduction Act. And others also make really good economic sense for the portfolio owner, especially in new construction.
What is the Inflation Reduction Act? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden. And it's one of the most monumental climate bills that has ever been passed in the U.S.
I wouldn't have thought it was anything to do with climate.
Well, there's a reason.
They decided to call it the Inflation Reduction
There's a reason there's not climate in the title.
Okay, right.
But I was going to say, I literally have never seen so many people who work in climate in America so happy as I've seen.
Oh, that's nice. I'm happy for you guys.
Yeah. And so an example is that low and moderate income households can receive up to $14,000 in upfront incentives to make their homes more energy efficient and electrify their homes.
Mm-hmm. Wait,
that's an example of the type of incentives that come out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that means you can get a rebate. Like if you want to buy a heat pump, you can get thousands of dollars off the cost of that heat pump, basically making it less expensive to buy a highly energy efficient electric heat pump compared to a gas furnace.
Which also in the long term will save people
and
money.
It will save you money. Okay. Exactly.
Can I ask a really basic and kind of geeky question? Can you explain a heat pump to me?
Yes.
What is a heat pump? Sorry, I realized that sometimes I'm like, yeah, and I have no idea what we're talking about.
I kind of know what it is, but I feel like I'm guessing, and I would love to know more about what it is.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to try to answer it really simply too. So it's basically an appliance. Mm-hmm. I think of it as a reverse refrigerator. A refrigerator makes the air inside the refrigerator cold, right? And then you can reverse that flow. So a heat pump can be like a refrigerator and a reverse refrigerator. It basically is an air conditioner and a space heater at the same time. So this is also why I like heat pumps, because it takes air. It's very efficient. It's just changing the temperature of the air. And that is highly energy efficient. And it also means you're getting two appliances in one. And so if you have to replace your air conditioner or your gas furnace, you could replace it with a single appliance, a heat pump. And this is also really important for many people in the Western United States are noticing that they're actually feeling like they need air conditioning when they didn't used to. And this is because we're seeing the impacts of a warming climate. And so a bunch of people in Washington State have never had air conditioners, and now they are seeking to buy them. It's like, wait, stop. Don't buy an air conditioner. Buy two appliances in one. Buy a heat pump.
And is that different than a ground source heat pump?
It's a great question. So I just described an air source heat pump. But yeah, there's a ground source heat pump that basically uses air from the ground. It's kind of like a type of geothermal resource. Okay. And it takes the air from the ground and it uses that to bring air into your home.
Okay. Is there air in the ground?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
and ground source heat pumps are great, especially in cold climates. Okay. Air-to-air heat pumps are really great in warmer climates, but there's a lot of different technology options too.
That's what I was going to say. It sounds like the thing is that we have just all become so fluent in a certain set of technologies and that we're comfortable with, but actually there's a whole other set of technology that exists, that's there, that you can buy, that's great for efficiency and climate and everything. And I feel like the barrier to entry for people is that it's just a whole new set of language and things, and we don't feel comfortable with it. Yeah. And so you're like, oh, that's not for me. That's not for me. I don't know what it is.
That's exactly right. And one thing I will say is heat pumps have gotten way better in the past 5 to 10 years. Yeah. And so many contractors are not actually familiar, especially with the highly efficient cold climate heat pumps that exist. And so, most people, you're not going to go research this stuff. You're going to go to your contractor and you're going to say, hey, my gas furnace isn't working very well. What should I do? And the contractor is probably not going to say, hey, you should replace it with a heat pump.
Right.
But I think that's another aspect of this awareness building and contractor education. As we get more and more heat pumps out in the world, this needs to be something that the workforce is really capable of installing and excited to recommend because they work really well. And I think some contractors may have had bad experiences with the heat pumps of 15 plus years ago.
This is what I feel about with electric stoves. Whenever you've talked to someone who's like, I hate electric stoves, it's like, are you talking about the coil ones?
Yeah.
Like the coil ones.
That go red underneath.
Yeah. I was yeah. I mean, no one has those anymore. No one has those electric.
Those are trash, bro.
like you need to, it's like being like, oh, I drove an electric car 25 years ago and it wasn't any good. I do think that there's this thing with new technology is if someone has a bad experience with it or it's tough or it's not quite good, it takes quite a long time for them to then trust to have that interaction with it again.
It's like my dad with smartphones. Like the first time he did it, he was like, never again. And now he's like living his dream on his little Samsung or whatever it is. Yeah. It takes time, right? It takes time. You got to update the systems and stuff.
I love that analogy.
That's great. And induction stoves. Induction stoves are amazing, right? Like, I'm a very avid cook. And I also was the person that said, I hate electric stoves. And then I used an induction. It actually just took getting a little hot plate, $60 on Amazon, plugged it in. And I was like, this thing's amazing. And it's actually more controllable than gas.
Yeah. Because it's not an actual fire. Yeah.
You have been in like a battle with your parents to switch out their stoves.
They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it.
Oh, no, I know.
We're going to have to wait until
it dies.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say they die.
No.
Sorry, Mum. I love you. I hope you stay around for a long time. But yeah, I think they're because they spend a lot of money on it. They're really committed to it. But I think that argument about like efficiency is super important as well, right? And the quality of it is at the point now where
I think that especially in the UK, what's going to start happening is that it's the cost now of running our homes is going to become so prohibitive for people.
Yeah.
That in the past it was just a small group of people who were on like prepay meters or were really. Unfortunately, because they were poor, no one cared about them. And no one was listening to them, really, as is always the case. And now we're looking at like 40% of the British population having to make decisions about their energy usage because of costs. So we're going to start wanting to have conversations about better appliances, different sources, etc.
Yeah. And one thing I'll say, there's so many benefits of an all electric efficient home. And another one is that you don't have to deal with the volatility of gas prices, right? Electric prices are set in tariffs by the utility. The point is that they're much more stable in their cost structure than fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like energy efficient homes, so we're talking about homes where people can live and it has like a much smaller footprint on the climate. Are these solutions scalable like globally? Is like the heat pumps work everywhere in the world? Like no matter where you are, you can just get a heat pump and it will solve the problem? Or is there like different things that people need to be doing in different places?
It's a really great question. So my team operates we have a China office and we have an RMI partner in India. And so in China, for example, in the northern, really cold parts of China, you have these district heating systems. And so in those cases, it's a different solution. You would have you replace basically, it's more like power generation, right? So you got to replace the coal or gas fired power source for these large district heating systems with renewable sources. And that's something, the good news there is it's not an individual homeowner needs to make that decision. It actually can be done at a really massive scale by the government. In the middle regions of China, so the Yangtze River Delta region is one of them. There's 220 million people that live in this one province in China, right? That's 2/3 of the U.S. population.
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
Province.
China is a whole other scale.
Right.
Yeah. And so an example there is that a bunch, historically, because it hasn't been cold enough, they are not part of the district heating system. So instead, as consumers are getting wealthier, it does get uncomfortably cold in the winter and it gets uncomfortably hot in the summer. Right. And so consumers are beginning to adopt individual appliances. And we're working on a project to say, don't get a gas furnace, get a heat pump. And here's why. You get 2 in 1 and it's more cost effective and efficient. And so that's a good example of the type of thing we're doing in China. In India, I'll say the solution is not heat pumps in India.
Oh, okay. I was just about to say you're the best heat pump salesman I've ever met in my life. I feel like I'm going to buy a heat pump.
They are my new favorite clients.
In India, it's different.
Yeah. So, and then we have to think about all these climate zones across the world that are hot climate zones, right? And so in India, the challenge here is to make sure only 1 in 10 Indians actually have an air conditioner today. As the climate gets hotter, it is not just a comfort issue. It is a survivability issue to make sure that Indians have access to cooling that is affordable and that is efficient.
Right.
And so we're doing work to figure out how do you make super efficient, room air conditioners. And we ran something called the Global Cooling Prize a couple years ago that showed that it's technologically feasible to have a room air conditioner that's 5 times as efficient. And so now the project is to get that to scale with a bunch of manufacturers. And then there's also all these amazing passive cooling techniques you can do. And so you could have reflective paints and you can build buildings differently where actually those buildings are then more resilient when a heat wave comes through and you don't even need an appliance in the first place. So I view India as it's really an efficient cooling challenge is the main solution there to an efficient building.
I mean, that is... So, like, I love the idea that, you've got this one problem, it manifests differently, and there are all these different solutions. I think what I really, because when we started this episode, you were like 40%, like that is like heavy.
Every single house.
Heavy.
Yeah.
But the thing is we have the solutions here, right?
Yes.
This is one of those problems where we just have to do it.
That's exactly right. And so that's something that gives me so much hope in this sector is, so again, I'm just going to use US numbers, but I explained we have 110 million buildings. 90% of those are single family homes. And so if you just think for a moment, anyone that lives in a single family home, if every single person makes a commitment and says, wow, it's going to be more affordable, it's going to be healthier, and it's going to be better to have an all electric efficient home, we will solve this problem. The technology exists today. We know how to install these things. And so it's just a better solution.
So I want to, because you talked about the US and we talked about these like homes that we need to like the retrofit, right? Things we need to, where we're taking existing buildings and we're making them more efficient and greener, et cetera. What about in other parts of the world? Is it the same challenge or is it a different challenge? I know we talked about like heating and but I mean in terms of the buildings themselves, what is it in other parts of the world?
It's a really great question. So the thing we're working on there is we have to build new buildings right from the start. And the good news there is, as you said, we have the technology. In most cases, it is more economic to build a highly energy efficient all electric building. And then we need to be mindful of the materials that are going into that new construction. Building square footage, the size of New York City. So like one New York City is built every single month in the global south and will continue to be between now and 2050.
Wow.
Right?
It's mind-boggling.
It's
I might
totally
go into construction, cause
it's amazing. Yeah. It seems like it's like a good business to be in. And then think about it, right? All the concrete and steel that is going to go into that new construction, that's that 10% I was mentioning before, right? And if we can influence that to make sure there is low embodied carbon, low carbon concrete that is put into those buildings instead of the current high carbon concrete. If there are solutions found to produce steel with green hydrogen or other solutions, or just to use less concrete and steel in the first place, there's bamboo and mass timber and other solutions that have way less carbon intensive production methods that are part of the solution there. And then the second step is to make sure you're using low or zero embodied carbon materials, and then make sure that those buildings are all highly energy efficient and electric.
So like again, something that's actually achievable if we can get the scaling.
And I feel like these will be better, like nicer buildings to live in. I don't know why I get that sense, but it feels like, instead of being in a building that's not suited to the climate, like in terms of the weather, and instead of it being, I don't know, it just feels like it'll be a nicer experience. Is that something that you've found?
Yes. We have a ton of research that suggests that, for example, green buildings or others that are highly energy efficient or electric. So not only is there healthier indoor air quality, but worker productivity increases. You feel better inside the building. You can notice it. And certainly buildings that have more natural light, for example, and use less lighting, so you don't even have to turn on the lights at all, right?
That's my solution.
Those kinds of buildings there, it substantially increases worker productivity, and it's just a more comfortable space.
Yeah, so it's not like we're looking to because I think sometimes when we talk about climate and we talk about the changes we're going to have to make to be able to stay in within safe bounds of warming
territory.
it feels like it's an old sacrifice conversation, right? It's all like things we have to give up, things we can't do, and actually in this case, I feel like it's saying, actually, these buildings a lot of our buildings are actually not very nice to live in, and they're not very good for us. And we could actually both be better for the climate and better quality of life. It's not about sacrificing.
That's exactly right. And I think we have to just get out of that mindset. It is actually a green building is a much better building. It's a more productive building. It's a healthier building, and it's more affordable. And so like the future of these buildings is a better future. I'm excited about this future. I think I mentioned this statistic to you, but a child growing up in a household with a gas stove has a 42% increased risk of developing asthma symptoms. And that is the same as growing up in a household with a smoker. And so that's a good example of like, wow, you have an induction stove for cooks. It's better to cook with an induction stove.
Yeah.
And so it's a better cooking experience. It's a healthier experience, and it's more affordable.
Yeah. And it feels like that statistic around the gas stoves and the asthma, we know, for example, now that like you don't smoke indoors. If you smoke at all, you got to do it outside, right? Like you don't do that because you don't want to poison the people around you. Yeah. I think the more and more we understand exactly how these everyday things that are part of our lives are bad for us, the more intense, it's just because, human beings are like this, like it affects you directly. Yeah. You're going to take action more quickly, right? And I feel like there's just, I kind of feel like this, I like picturing like the kind of world we could live in. And I love the idea of like these like beautiful and like cool / warm when necessary, like houses that feel airy, like where you feel like you can breathe inside. Yes. It just feels like that is something I feel, it's like the difference between trying to stop things happening, but and striving towards something positive. I feel like the conversation here is about striving towards something really, really positive. And
it feels like something that's like on the horizon, right? Like it feels like something that's possible and achievable and like better. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to my heat pump.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
So, Stephanie, do you have a climate confession?
Oh yeah, I have a lot. I have a lot of climate confessions.
Oh yeah.
Wait, sorry. Does it need to be about buildings or can
no,
it be about
anything?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, my climate confession is, so I have one car, so I am happy that I'm not a 2-car family, but that one car is a gas-powered Subaru, and I drive it a lot to and from the mountains where I live in Colorado, and I'm hoping one day I'll swap it out for something electric, but I haven't found something I can drive to and from through the snow that meets my needs.
Yeah.
So. And honestly, it's pretty expensive to do it, so I haven't made the switch yet.
Yeah.
We have to. I'm gonna find a survey of how many American climate scientists drive electric cars or drive gas cars.
You know what it is here is you realize that
the terrain.
We live in cities.
Yeah.
So like it's fine to like get a tiny little like a Zoe and like drive it and pick up your kids or whatever it is in a city. But yeah, if you're driving across actual terrain, the options are expensive.
Yeah.
And if they
few
exist,
and far between.
Yeah.
They are. And sometimes, I mean, I am an adventurous person, and so is my family, and we are sometimes driving off on these crazy dirt roads to go into the mountains, and I need to know that I don't have to rely on a charger for those
if the battery dies, you're stuck.
But I will say I'm really optimistic for the future there. Like I think some the costs are coming down. There's incentives to continue to bring the cost down, and I think the chargers are going in the ground. So I am optimistic that
and we're getting more and more
change.
Mileage, right? The battery's getting better, so
exactly.
if you start getting like 600-700 miles out of every charge, then it's getting easier to like not feel so worried that you're gonna like run out.
Yeah, but I still drive that car around.
I love it.
It's terrible.
Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a fascinating conversation about buildings and about people and the way we live and the way we could live in the future. And remember,
stay curious. Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter.
Comms written by Tess Lowry.
Artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus.
Curation by Maryam Pasha.
Mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshty.
Music also by Ben Beheshty.
Presented by Ben Hurst
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.